For this video, I want to go over my experiences with 5 and 10 gallon tanks. For anyone short on time, I think 10 gallon tanks will be the best option for most people, but 5 gallon tanks do have their place in the hobby. I want to quickly say that the footage in this video is from all of my aquariums regardless of their size. So starting with tank size, and in all honesty this one is going to be a bit of a nightmare. Depending on country, there's US gallons, imperial gallons and litres, making the conversions a little bit off depending on your location. For example, 12 and 8 US gallon tanks like these two are more common here in Europe than a traditional 10 US gallon tank because of the litre to US gallon conversion. I have seen some 20 litre tanks that is close to 5 US gallons, but most places seem to prefer 25 litres and above, which is around 6.6 US gallons. In addition to that, there's also rectangle, cube and orb shaped tanks, throwing more variables into the mix, but I would recommend that most people opt for a rectangle long shaped tank if possible. So just to quickly go over some dimensions, this is my 45 litre rectangle tank that is just under 12 US gallons and has the dimensions of 20 by 12 by 12 inches or 50 by 30 by 30 centimetres. This is my 30 litre cube tank, and I've got a couple of these, and it comes in at just under 8 US gallons and has the dimensions of 11 by 11 by 14 inches or 29 by 29 by 35 centimetres. And these are my 25 litre rectangle tanks, which come in at around 6.6 US gallons, the closest thing I have to a 5 US gallon tank, and these have the dimensions of 16 by 10 by 10 inches or 40 by 25 by 25 centimetres. As the volumes of the tanks suggest, a 5 US gallon tank will usually be around half the size of a 10 US gallon tank, giving the 5 gallon tank its main advantage. The smaller space required for a 5 gallon tank makes it perfect for anyone who does have limited space available for their aquarium. Some landlords also put limitations on the sizes of the aquariums you can keep in the property as well, forcing some people to go with a 5 gallon tank over a 10 gallon tank. If you do have limited space or restrictions from a landlord, then a 5 US gallon tank can be a great option, but personally I'd always lean more towards an 8 or 10 US gallon tank. So moving on to a cost comparison, and most people seem to think that a 10 US gallon tank will be far more expensive than a 5 US gallon tank, but that's not always the case, especially in the United States. I want to use these two Aquarium tanks as an example that are available from Petco. This 5.5 US gallon tank is usually listed at $24.99 or as cheap as $12.49 in the Petco half off Aquarium sale. This 10 US gallon tank is usually available for $29.99 or $14.99 in the sale, so the price difference between the two is minimal. At regular price, the difference between them is only $5 or $2.50 if you can get it in the sale. Unfortunately, outside of the US, we have to pay considerably more for our aquariums, and here in Europe, the Diversa range is the best option that I've found for budget tanks. 6 of my 10 aquariums are from the Diversa range, and I've never once had a problem with them, so I do recommend them if you are on a budget. This is slightly larger than 5 US gallons, but where I live I'm usually looking at around £30 or $39 for a 25 litre tank, or around £60 or $78 for a 45 litre tank. Now these are just entry level tanks, and prices rapidly increase if you go for the Aquascaping tanks with low iron gas or transparent silicone, so keep that in mind. You also have to factor in the costs for tank accessories such as lights, filters and heaters, and the 10 gallon options usually are more expensive than the 5 gallon options. Personally, I'd recommend that you take the time to sit down with a spreadsheet or a pen and paper and work out the total cost of the aquarium you're thinking of, but if possible I'd always recommend going for the 10 gallon tank. So moving on to stocking options, and the goals for your specific tank and the specific shape of your aquarium are going to come into play here. In my opinion, a betta fish or some type of Neocaridina shrimp colony will be the best option for a 5 gallon tank, with a rectangle shape being better for a betta fish. I have seen some people who keep guppies, endless live bearers, scarlet baddis, smaller killifish and sparkling gourami in 5 gallon tanks, but personally I would always lean more towards a 10 gallon tank if possible. In addition to all of those previous suggestions, a 10-gallon rectangle tank also opens up small groups of popular fish such as neon tetras, chili rasboras, pygmy cories, celestial pearl danios, honey gourami and green neons. There are a couple of other stocking options out there too, but they do tend to be a little more difficult to find in pet stores. In my opinion, a 10-gallon tank will usually be the better option when it comes to stocking because it opens you up to additional species, and something like a betta fish that can be kept in a 5 US gallon tank will usually do better in a 10-gallon tank. Moving on to maintenance and care, and there's a bunch of different variables that will come into play for this one depending on your specific setup. Tank maintenance can include regular partial water changes, gravel vacuuming the substrate to remove fish waste, trimming live plants and removing algae from your tank glass. In my experience though, the time difference between maintaining the two different sizes really is minimal. Most buckets are large enough to hold enough water for a 25% partial water change in a 10-gallon tank, and there's probably a 1 to 3 minute difference between the two sizes during maintenance. Gravel vacuuming, trimming live plants and removing algae will depend on the choices you make for the live plants in your aquarium too. Take my old 29-gallon tank for example, where I kept epiphyte plants such as Anubias, Java Fern and Bucephalandra as well as moss, and I really didn't need to do much with that tank other than partial water changes. On the flip side of that, my far smaller Wallstad shrimp tank needs me to remove fistfuls of Salvinia every single week, as well as trim the Rotala rotundifolia once or twice per month. The smaller Wallstad tank also has less issues with algae due to the faster grown plants sucking up a lot of the excess nutrients in the water that the algae would use. Keeping slow grown plants in your aquarium can reduce the amount of trimming required, but it may also increase the amount of algae grown, so there is a balancing act there, so I'm calling this one a draw. Moving on to water quality and stability, and there's a bunch of different variables at play for this one. The main variables to consider is the water volume, your filter capacity, the number of fast grown plants in your aquarium and the stocking levels of your fish and invertebrates. I've seen a bunch of different people say that larger volumes of water are easier to keep stable, and for the most part this is true. A single drop of ammonia in a 5-gallon tank is effectively double the amount than in a 10-gallon tank due to the relative water volume. Another way to look at this is that the waste produced by a betta fish will have more of an effect on the water parameters in a 5-gallon tank than in a 10-gallon tank. That said, a small 5-gallon tank that's been set up with plenty of live plants like my Wallstad shrimp tank rarely has issues with its water parameters. There's just too many fast grown plants in there for the ammonium and nitrate to get out of hand. I know that this is a shrimp tank, but the cherry shrimp colony in this specific tank currently has around 70 shrimp in it, so I guess the total bioload is equal to or more than a betta fish. Then we have smaller setups like this one running on a cheap basic sponge filter, and it maintains stable water parameters. I always like to upsize my filters, and I try to use filters that are rated for at least 20-gallon tanks in my 5 to 10-gallon ranges. These filters are only slightly more expensive, but they have a lot more surface area on them so they can maintain safe and stable water parameters in your tank. In my experience, both 5 and 10-gallon tank sizes will be easy to cycle if you use an ammonia solution. Personally, I use Dr. Tim's ammonia solution, but there's a ton of different products on the market, but always follow the specific instructions on your product because the ammonia strength can differ slightly. Personally, I would lean more towards this one being a draw between 5 and 10-gallon tanks, but if you are looking to set up your very first aquarium, then I probably would lean more towards a 10-gallon tank because the additional water volume acts as a safety net. Moving on to filtration options, and there's a ton of different filter types on the market these days. At smaller tank volumes like these, most people will be using a cheap hang-on-back spillway filter, a hang-on-back canister filter, sponge filters, box filters, internal filters, or the Wallstad method. These all have their place in the hobby, but personal preference will definitely come into play. For anyone who is unfamiliar, the Wallstad method takes advantage of fast-grown stem and floating plants for natural filtration in the aquarium rather than using a manufactured filter. Personally, I prefer full Wallstad method tanks or a combination of the Wallstad method with a sponge or box filter, but most of these filter types should work fine. As I mentioned earlier though, I always try to upsize my filter, so I always try and do that and find something that's rated for a 20-gallon tank, and you should be fine with your water parameters. Moving on to aesthetics in aquascaping, and there's plenty of channels out there that specialise in this type of content. These channels have proven time and time again that you can create beautiful aquascapes in small nano tanks, and size really doesn't matter. That said, given the current costs of hardscape, aquasoil and plants, it could be argued that a smaller 5-gallon tank will be cheaper to aquascape than a larger 10-gallon tank depending on what you have planned. That's why I lean more towards a 5-gallon tank for this one, because it can be a lot cheaper when it comes to the hardscape, but if you're not bothered about the aesthetics of your tank, then I'd still go with the 10-gallon. Just to offer a quick conclusion, and the 5-gallon tank can be a great option if you have limited space or restrictions on the tank size you can keep from your landlord. Other than that though, I really do think that a 10-gallon or even an 8 US gallon tank will be a far better option in most situations. The slight increase in tank volume just lets you do so much more, and like I mentioned, if you are in the USA, the price difference really isn't that much. People in other countries will usually have to spend more for a 10-gallon tank, but in my opinion it's definitely worth it. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching and have a good day.